Welcome back to Hermetic Perspective. This is part 3 of my series on Plato's Republic, and in this video we're going to be finishing up Book 2. So in the second half of Book 2, Plato basically lays out his guidelines for the description of the gods in poetry, and he begins constructing his criticisms of Homer and Hesiod and the way which they portray the gods. He believes that's not in line with their true nature, and he says that in his ideal city, which he develops in the Republic, you would not be allowed to portray the gods in this way, and Homer and Hesiod would be censored. According to Proclus, in Book 2, Plato sets out to prove 4 things about the gods which contradict how Homer depicts them. 1. The gods are never responsible for evil or harm. 2. The gods are only responsible for good things. 3. The gods never undergo change. And 4. The gods never mislead or deceive. The first point here is a direct criticism of stories from Homer's poems in which the gods inflict harm on individuals, be they human or other gods. Now, this does not comport with the Platonic conception of the gods as being absolute good. We must understand what good means in this context in Platonism. It doesn't just mean that the gods act good, nor that they just appear good. He means that they are intrinsically good. We must remember that the gods in Neoplatonism, otherwise known as henads, are unitary entities who embody the simplistic goodness of the One in a form which is able to take action. While the One is the principle which undergirds and progenerates the universe, the gods are the first projections of this principle. The gods are unitary and so entirely free from concepts like evil or the ability to inflict harm, which are markers of lower, more complex realms of existence further from the goodness of the One. Essentially, the gods do not just choose to be good, nor do they choose to not do evil. It's simply the way they are. There's no other choice for them. It is what they do. Now, to prove this, Proclus gives us this chain of logic. Firstly, we accept that all gods are really intrinsically good in this way, which we must accept if we're to accept Platonism at all. Now, 2, nothing really good is harmful. 3, that which is not harmful cannot do harm. 4, that which does no evil cannot be responsible for evil. Essentially, the gods, as unitary entities, cannot be responsible for any evils as, like we discussed in last video, injustice only comes out of complexity, and a simple soul cannot commit injustice in this way. With this, it flows pretty well from the last video where we discussed the origins of injustice, and we can now understand that without the conditions for this origin of injustice, the gods simply cannot be unjust. Now, the second point, that being that the gods are only responsible for good things, is obviously related to the first point, but it's not exactly the same. So just because we've proven that the gods do not commit evil, we haven't necessarily proven that they only commit good acts. It could be possible that they do neutral things or things that can't be categorized easily. So to prove that the gods are only responsible for good things, Proclus gives us this proof. 1. Once again, we must accept that every god is really intrinsically good in this way. 2. That which is really good is beneficial. 3. That which is exclusively beneficial exclusively benefits. 4. That which exclusively benefits only does good things. And 5. That which does only good is responsible for good things. The point being made here in this argument may seem rather obvious. It's that the gods can only be responsible for good, since, as we discussed before, they are essentially good, not by choice, but by nature. The third point that Plato seeks to prove in the end of Book 2 is that the gods never undergo change. Now, this is in response to stories from Homer and Hesiod, such as one where Zeus comes down to earth in the form of a bull, and gods often change their forms, disguise themselves as other things. And Plato is here saying that this is not the true nature of the gods, and in reality, the gods cannot change their form in any way. His assertion is essentially that what is divine is impassive in every respect. It neither changes nor engages in the deception that it does change. Now, for something to change form, there are basically 2 options. First, something else is acting upon it and forcing it to change form. Or 2, it's acting upon itself and forcing itself to change form. Now, both of these scenarios present problems for our Platonic understanding of the nature of the gods. Logically, for something to change something else, for something to be able to act upon the gods and change them, this would necessarily imply that something is more powerful than the gods, because to change something else, you have to be more powerful than it. You can't change something that you're weaker than. Now, we know from Plato and in Neoplatonism that there is nothing more powerful than the gods. Of course, the one is technically above them, but the gods are really just projections of the one. And that essential principle, there's nothing above that. There's nothing that can challenge the gods. Therefore, there's nothing that can act on them and force them to change in any way. The other option is that the gods are changing of their own volition. They're forcing themselves to change. According to Proclus, you can only change for the better or for the worse. You can't change neutrally. So if the gods are changing for the worse, this leaves us with another two options. One, they're acting in ignorance, and they're changing themselves for the worse without knowing it. Or two, they're changing themselves for the worse on purpose. Now, both of these are problematic for the omniscient nature of the gods. Obviously, they can't have not known something. They can't be acting in ignorance because this would contradict the, once again, omniscient nature of the gods. It doesn't make any sense. And to change themselves for the worse willingly while knowing that they're changing themselves for the worse also doesn't make sense because no logical being would do something like that. No thinking being would want to become worse and willingly change themselves in that way. So if changing for the worse contradicts the nature of the gods, then what about changing for the better? Changing for the better obviously implies that there is something better than what once was. So if you have the gods and they're changing for the better, this implies that they're changing to something above themselves, which we know cannot exist. If they are changing for the better, this implies that they lacked something before, which cannot be true, as they are already perfect beings by nature in Neoplatonism. Therefore, the gods must be unchanging in order to comport with their characterization in Plato's writings. Now, on the fourth and final point, that being the gods never mislead or deceive, Proclus gives us a pretty tidy explanation of the possibilities for why a god would mislead. So the gods either have been deceived themselves and so in turn deceive us, or the gods deceive on purpose while knowing the truth. So these are the two possible reasons that the gods would deceive, and both of them do not line up with their characterization in Platonism once again. If we accept the first option, that would make the gods imperfect beings, as something more intelligent or more powerful would have to have deceived them. They can't be deceived by something below them. This is the same logic as the one from last point, where there can't be something above the gods to force them to change, nor to deceive them. It just doesn't make sense. So if we accept the gods are the top of the hierarchy, we can't then accept that they've been deceived. The alternative, that being that the gods have deceived us on purpose, we know cannot be true because earlier we proved that the gods could not inflict evil or harm in any form, and deceit is a form of harm, so this cannot be true. Therefore, there's no way that the gods could possibly mislead or deceive us, which they do multiple times in the Iliad and the Odyssey and in Hesiod's poetry. So there's just another reason that Plato disagrees with these poets, and another reason he thinks that they should not be allowed in his ideal city-state. Now that these 4 points have been proven, we have some questions. There are things in our observable reality which contradict Plato's characterization of the gods. We have to beg the question and try to understand how we can reconcile these contradictions. So for one, if evil does not come from the gods, it must come from somewhere else. This means that there must be a first principle separate and opposed to the gods, which would contradict Plato. 2. How do the theurgists have revelations from the gods where the gods appear to them in luminous form with auditory and visual output if the gods are incorporeal as described by Plato? And 3. How do false oracular visions occur if the gods do not lie? So to answer the first point, here's what I've come to understand from Proclus's commentary. Now, evil is neither a form nor a first principle. Forms themselves cannot be evil, as they are projections of the One, which we have already proven to be intrinsically good. And matter itself is also not evil, as it also comes from the One, and it contributes to the structure of the universe. It's necessary. Matter is not necessarily good, but it's also not evil. It's neutral. It's needed for existence. Evil is a byproduct with many partial causes, not a singular principle with one cause. Evil in a soul is caused by competing and opposing forms of life, just as in a body, competing elements cause disease. Evil is not a standalone principle, but it's simply a product of turmoil and disruption of the principle of the one. Basically saying that there's no progenitor of all evil. Evil doesn't come from one source. It really just comes from disruptions to the one's system, the one's hierarchy, and when conflicting parts of that hierarchy come into contact in ways that they're not supposed to, that's what creates evil. It's chaos. It's not a singular entity and not a singular principle. On the second point, Proclus explains that theurgists, who are essentially ritual workers in Neoplatonism, who use ritual and magic practice to get closer to the gods, but he explains that theurgists are not seeing the gods themselves. They're simply seeing a projection of the gods. The incorporeal gods can project out luminous forms of themselves, complete with visual and auditory stimuli, and they can be seen by humans, but it's not the god himself. Essentially, when theurgists encounter gods, they're not encountering the god, but simply their projected form. Finally, on the third point, Proclus tells us that oracular error, or when oracles predict things incorrectly, is not caused by a singular principle, just like evil. It's not caused by the gods lying. It's because of a myriad of human errors, a confluence of a lot of different things coming together to produce that error. He's basically just saying that it's not the gods' fault, they're not lying, it's just that the oracle did not interpret the message right, or did not have the skill to interpret that message right. And that's his explanation for why oracles can be wrong sometimes, and why that doesn't contradict with the gods being unable to mislead or deceive. Thus concludes Plato's arguments in Book 2, as well as Proclus's analysis of them. Now, this was a bit of a shorter video than usual, but it's really just preparation for the next few videos, which are going to be on Proclus's long-form, book-length essay on what he believes to be the actual agreement of Homer and Plato on the depiction of the gods. He's going to argue that essentially, even though Plato criticizes Homer and says that he's wrong about a lot of things, they can actually be reconciled, and he spends a long time doing this. And it's really a great text, and it's rich in Neoplatonic doctrine, and I'm really excited to make videos about it. I've already gone through reading it, and I'm writing the scripts and such, but it's going to be really good. That's honestly might be the highlight of this series of videos on the Republic, so I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll tune in for that. Please subscribe if you're interested in that. I think that's really going to be worthwhile, and this next video coming is going to be really good. So thank you for watching, and have a good one.